About several issues around sustainability using rice as a kind of a model crop, because I've been involved with rice research. I had been involved with rice research quite a lot before I came to Worcester, and it allows me to pick out some of the many issues in sustainability, because different people are thinking about sustaining different things, as you'll see. So rice, Asian rice, is a grass, all cereals are grasses. And this one's called Oryza sativa. And let's just consider where the crop came from. This guy, Nikolai Vavilov, is a giant in biology, but very under-recognized. He worked in Russia during the 1920s, 30s, and was persecuted by the kind of Stalinist regime. Genetics didn't go down too well in Russia at the time, because all men are born equal, and genetics says actually they're different. So he suffered under those circumstances, but he came up with this general idea that there are certain regions of the world where crop plants were developed, and domesticated may sound an odd word, but only in certain parts of the world and not in others. Now that's no doubt something to do with the societies that were operating there, but also seems to be something to do with the genetic variation within the species that became crops, because these are the regions of the world where you find the greatest range of genetic diversity. So people who teach in this area now always refer to Vavilov and his work as being seminal in this area. So genetic diversity, genetic resources. We talk about conservation. Often we think about conserving pandas or white rhinos, or we think about the species. But here we're thinking about conserving the genetic variation within a species. Why? Because some of those variants, some of those forms, are used still in agriculture, as we'll see in a moment, in rice. So they need to be conserved for farming purposes. They contain a range of genes and combinations of genes, forms of genes that can be used by plant breeders, and we'll come on to that. But also for people who want to understand how plants grow and develop and respond to their environment, knowing that there are different forms of genes in different members of a species can be very informative, looking at how those genes are deployed by the plants. So from a pure science point of view. So genetic diversity within crop species and their wild relatives was recognized as being very important about, well, it's 50 years ago now, and around the world various centers were set up to conserve the genetic diversity of certain crop plants and to engage in crop breeding, plant breeding, and scientific investigations of the crops. And the one for rice is in the Philippines, not far from Manila, and I've been fortunate enough to go there on a number of occasions. So these are the plots. Now that looks like a lawn, but that's different forms of rice. And this is me here, so you can see I haven't managed to sustain the same waistline or the same colour here. So one of the things about the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI as it's called, is that it contains something they call the rice gene bank. Now molecular biologists think of genes as things we've cloned and we've got the sequences of. Here we're talking about over 110,000 packets of seeds. So these have been collected largely from around Southeast Asia and are Oryza sativa. Some of them are the wild relatives, other species. And they're stored in foil packets, they're dried and held at minus 20 degrees in a giant cold room, and there's a duplicate store held in Fort Collins in the US, so that they are safe and we're not going to lose them. And you'll see one of the reasons we might lose them in a moment. But some of those forms of rice are used directly by farmers and have been collected from farms in trips around various countries and then held at IRRI. And these forms of rice are called Landraces, a term you may not have come across before. So they are not lines of rice that have been produced by deliberate breeding to produce hybrids that outperform either parent, or the classical breeding kind of story. These are forms that grow well in a particular region, in a particular village. So if you go to a particular village where there may be a dozen farmers in Cambodia or wherever, you may find that within the village there are 8 or 9 different landraces being used, and this farmer grows these 3 at different times of the year, because he may get 3 different crops at different times during the year, and he's been using them all of his life, and his grandparents did, and their grandparents, and they've been grown there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. They're locally adapted. They grow reasonably well there, and they sustain the farmer, but it's subsistence farming. So you collect, you harvest the crop, some of the seed you put aside because that's what you're going to grow next year, and the rest you eat. And you may not be eating much more than rice in some of these communities. So this picture may look a little bit like a rural idyll, but it's back-breaking work. And the average production is about, using these landraces is about 2 tons per hectare, which is really quite low. If we look at then issues to do with sustainability and subsistence farming using landraces, now we're using rice here, in another part of the world it would be another crop, but the concepts, the principles are the same. So let's look at this range of different areas and how sustainability kind of maps onto them. So if you are growing landraces, then your farming processes are very sustainable because you're using very low inputs. You're not just using a locally adapted form of rice, but you're probably just putting some manure on from your draft animals. But you're not using fertilizers. You're almost certainly not using pesticides, and with rice, herbicides are not usually needed, because rice growing in paddy fields is outcompeting the weeds. Most weeds can't grow underwater. So it's very sustainable from the point of view of your inputs. With regard to rice genetic resources, and I hope I've explained that concept to you, thousands or hundreds of thousands of different forms of rice are being maintained by subsistence farming around Southeast Asia, some of which are now held at IRRI for safekeeping. With regard to food supply, subsistence farming provides poor food security. It may seem it is very sustainable with regard to the farming process, but if something goes wrong in a particular year, political unrest or unseasonal frosts, or not with rice, but floods or some sort of catastrophe, you can be in real trouble because you haven't got any reserves in real subsistence farming. And if something goes wrong with the food supply, well, it obviously has an impact on population levels. And as we'll see, as rice varieties were improved, there was a huge effect on human population levels. And of course there are knock-on effects on social development, because if we're talking here about real subsistence farming, there's not much of a cash economy, and developing social structures and proper healthcare and education and so on tends not to happen without overseas aid or without money coming in from elsewhere within the country. Okay, now that's the way things were in many parts of Southeast Asia until around the 60s, and then there's been a move quite rapidly in some countries and more gradually in others, starting with what we have called the Green Revolution, which I'm sure most of you will have heard of, well known for the work of Norman Borlaug with wheat, where a major part of the Green Revolution was the development of new varieties. I know there are other aspects to it, like greater inputs of chemicals and mechanization and so on. We'll touch on those in a minute, but at the core of the Green Revolution for cereals was the development of new varieties, and this happened with wheat and it happened with rice, and one of the key things in the breeding program, which is a bit complicated because you don't just cross 2 forms of rice and get one that's superb, you have to put a bit more effort into it than that. But one of the key steps was breeding in a shorter straw rice, from this variety, this landrace, I beg your pardon, DG Wugen, which came from China. And crudely speaking, if a rice is not putting so much of its resources into the stem growth, it's putting more into its grain. It's a bit more complex than that, but its resource allocation in plants is something that breeders try to control. And we don't want tall rice plants. Why would we? They just fall over. Let's get them to put more of their effort into grain production. So the Green Revolution led in rice to the production of IR8, so-called miracle rice, which was produced at IRRI and made freely available to anybody who wanted to use it. And it led to dramatic increases in yield. So in the Philippines, where it was produced, it's an international centre, the Erie, but it happens to be in the Philippines, and that's where the impacts were seen earliest. The rice production increased from 3.7 to 7.7 million tonnes per hectare. Oh, sorry, within the country. That would be quite more than doubled within 2 decades, and it affected the economy of the Philippines because the Philippines became a rice exporter for the first time. But there are adverse effects on the environment which are well documented, because you're just not growing a new form of rice that's high yielding and everything's rosy. It's high yielding partly because it's very responsive to added nitrogen, added fertilizer. So you've bred something that if you apply fertilizer, the yields really take off, and if you don't, you only get a modest increase in yield. So, okay, so IR8 was a big breakthrough. Since then, we'll come on to the further developments, but so now the kind of farming landscape has changed. So we're now talking about new varieties like IR8 and its relatives. So the farming process is now less sustainable, because if you're growing IR8, it's a sensible strategy for an individual farmer to apply more fertilizer, because then his yield goes up more, his outputs are increased, but of course his inputs are increased. Growing something like IR8, if you imagine in the Philippines, loads and loads of Landraces being used all across the country, and suddenly Miracle Rice comes along, and a farmer says, wow, I'm not going to grow these anymore, I'm going to grow IR8, and hundreds of other farmers do that as well, then genetic resources are under threat, because you can lose those forms, and those forms can be valuable to plant breeders, to people who want to study how rice works. And that's one of the key reasons why Erie was set up, to keep those in safe storage so that they're available still to anyone who wants to work with them, breed with them, study them. Food security was greatly increased, and yields increased in different parts of Asia by different amounts, but often by tenfold. And so population levels are not so constrained, because rice, people say that wheat is the most important cereal crop, but in terms of what people survive on, what poor people eat, rice is far more important. And so populations increased directly as a result of increased food supply and increased food security. And of course, with good governance, which is a huge proviso, then if people are eating well and have got spare cash because they're able to sell some rice, then there should be the possibility for developing social structures. But of course we enter into the realms of politics here, and often that doesn't happen, but it should. Now, when I started working with Erie, I was working at the great pleasure to work with Gurdjieff Kush. He came along and started to work at Erie after IR8 had been developed, and developed a whole new set of generation of over 300 new rice strains, taking IR8 a bit further, making it more appropriate for growing in this region of Pakistan or this region of Bangladesh, introducing more resistance genes to different insect pests and so on. And so at one stage he produced a quite famous IR36, which I've done quite a lot of work on. And in 1996 he was awarded the World Food Prize, which is not quite the Nobel Prize, but it's getting on that way. And the work I did with him and his colleagues led to quite a lot of publications all around the use of these molecular markers in rice. So, I don't expect you to know what molecular markers are, but you will have heard of DNA fingerprinting, which we apply in forensic cases to humans. Well, you can apply the same kinds of technologies to any plant, animal, fungus, and you get a series of bands where each of these tracks is for a different rice type, and you get these bands which are shared between the first two, and in some cases there's a band in this one and not in that one. And you can look at how closely related different forms of rice are by how many bands they share. And you can get hundreds and thousands of different independent bands that you can use in this kind of strategy. And the sort of things that I was doing was, for example, being able to go to the 110,000 packets of seed and say, well, which of these rices are going to be more easy to cross with each other, and find which ones were most closely related because they shared more bands, and so breeders would know, I can use this one because it crosses easily with the parent I'm working with. And I'll miss out the next bit, which is heavy genetics, and I haven't left enough time to talk about it. Let's move through to the next phase in rice development, which is genetically modified rice. Now, rice hasn't been a prime target for genetic modification like cotton and like some other crops grown in Europe and the US, but the processes that are used are largely the same. This bacterium, agrobacterium, has been transferring bits of DNA to plants for millions of years, and we know which genes it transfers, and the trick is to take out those genes and put in the genes you want to put into rice, and it does the job for you. You grow the rice in tissue culture, and this is where I've done some work in trying to develop techniques that more efficiently regenerate plants from tissue culture. It's referred to as in vitro gardening by my biochemical colleagues, which I find very hurtful because there is some rationale behind it. But if we look at rice, what sorts of genes have been transferred? Well, people have put in genes for insect resistance. Some people put in genes for herbicide resistance, although weed control isn't a huge problem with rice. And there's a project on vitamin A content I want to mention to you just very briefly. So insect resistance, there's a gene from a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, which produces something called Bt toxin, which are little proteins. So there are genes within this bacterium encoding proteins which kill insects, because the proteins bind to part of their gut, give them terminal indigestion, and they die. And these are the crystalline proteins. They form crystals for reasons we needn't go into. If you're an organic gardener, you can spray either a concoction, a sort of solution of the bacteria or of the crystals directly onto your allotment, and that's absolutely fine. Nobody regards that as a threat. But what's been done with rice and many other plants is to take the gene from the bacterium that encodes this particular protein and transfer it to the plant. So the rice plant makes that protein and protects itself against insects, like leafhoppers are quite a big pest in rice. And that's where some controversy has ensued, as with anything to do with GM. The project that is much more acceptable to most people is this one which involves vitamin A deficiency in rice and in general diets in parts of Asia. 250,000 children in Southeast Asia go blind each year because of lack of vitamin A, and this project aims to increase the vitamin A levels within the starchy bit of the seed of rice, within the endosperm, by transferring not one gene but a series of genes that encode these enzymes, and so you're transferring a little pathway that leads to the production of provitamin A, which happens to be a carotenoid, so you can see when it's worked because you get this carotenoid, carroty colour. So this is the wild type rice, the rice that hasn't been engineered. This is a recent generation of rice which is producing lots of provitamin A and is solving a health problem within the Southeast Asia. And this is called golden rice because it looks golden, and it's a humanitarian project, and these varieties are available to anyone that wants them through IRI. So finally, and I'm running a bit late, what does GM mean in terms of sustainability? The fact that these are GM varieties, how does that affect the kind of the list of issues that I've listed here? Well, in general, it's no different to growing normal varieties of rice, the sustainability issues, except that the farming process may be altered depending on which gene you've introduced. So if you put in a gene for insect resistance, you may end up not spraying with pesticides so often. If you put in a gene that confers herbicide resistance, you may end up spraying more with herbicides because you know you're not going to affect your crop because it's got protection, but you may want better weed protection. Some rice is not grown in paddy fields where weeds are more of a problem. What's the effect on the food supply? Well, it depends again on the gene that you've put in. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that GM varieties are no different to modern bred varieties in most instances, but you need to consider the gene that you've introduced and what impact it might have on sustainability. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.